Hello!
And welcome or welcome back to Party Trick Astrology. I'm Nina.
I'm Shaina.
And this is Lilith in the 8th house. This is another installment of our Lilith series. We're doing sign house, sign house, sign house. We're getting into the thick of it with Lilith in the 8th house. We're doing the Black Moon Lilith, but we also have a video in which we explain the story of Lilith and all of the different Liliths that exist. So if you want to brush up on your Lilith information, you can check out that video in the card, and tons of links in the description. Readings from me, readings from Shaina, different channels, there's so much stuff. Just like use your own eyeballs and peruse through that down bar.
Yeah, I think that covers
I also
it.
took Shayna's line. Usually Shayna's the one that says all of the down bar shit, and I talk about.
I feel like it's whoever says it. I was like, well, let her take it this time, you know? The thing that I kind of want to start this Lilith in the 8th house video with is typically with any planet in the 8th house, that kind of represents how you use the occult to kind of satisfy those energies. But with Lilith in the 8th house, I think it's a little bit different because Lilith's nature is naturally her obsession for kind of controlling you. So I think it kind of almost feels with Lilith in the 8th house as though Lilith uses you for her own occult or hidden nature kind of wants. Like she works through you. You know, anything occult or hidden are just basically things that you cannot explain logically, things that aren't really seen, more under the surface, more psychological urges and stuff like that.
The 8th house is also an interesting house because it's one of those houses that you just constantly hear as being more characteristic. You know, as we're going through this series, we're going sign house, and the sort of pattern of that is we say Lilith through the sign, these are the characteristics that she takes on, and in the house, this is the area of your life in which she shows up. And with the 8th house, it's very typical to hear that anything in the 8th house just sort of embodies and takes on those scorpionic traits. So even though this Lilith in the 8th house is showing up in your 8th house of joint finances, of death, sex, regeneration, of intimacy in general, of your relationship to the occult and deeper spirituality, Lilith is also taking on those deeper characteristics of not only being in Gemini or not only being in Leo, but also being a bit more dark, being a bit more in tune with the occult, interested in getting deep, getting intimate. And what Shaina said was like spot on. She's using you to be able to quench that thirst for that depth, for that knowledge.
Yes, with Lilith, the placement is always kind of kicked off with a feeling that you're exiled from that energy. So a lot of times with Lilith in the 8th house, it can indicate you searching for this 8th house intimate connection from a young age and not receiving it. Either you're receiving it in an inappropriate manner or you just don't get to make that connection at all. A very common thing also that I think is a big unfortunate kind of kickoff with Lilith in the 8th house is your early perception of sex is probably violent or humiliating or somehow through the lens of abuse, either to you or a loved one. It can be a really hard thing to experience at a young age. Kind of similar with Lilith and Scorpio, there can be like a divorce, there could be a loss of a parent or somebody close to you at a young age. It doesn't have to be that extreme. It can just be this feeling that you're denied true positive intimacy. And also with Lilith is that itch we have to scratch. Lilith, especially in the 8th house, wants to kind of dive into the deep end with people really quickly. In this, I can see them sometimes having these odd expectations or these odd things that they put on relationships. Whereas they can interpret somebody flirting or having a crush or this and that as though it meaning that now instantly we're jumping into this 8th house intimate relationship. And there can be some miscommunication and misunderstanding with that. And a lot of heartbreak can happen to the Lilith in the 8th house because they don't understand. Because I feel like Lilith in the 8th house can really care so deeply for others. And even that misunderstanding and misinterpretation of that connection can lead them to being exiled in the future, lead them to feeling like they need to even exile themselves from intimate relationships. Oh, because every time it happens, they leave me, or every time it happens, this happens, or this is the bad thing, or I'm just over these people that say they want commitment, but they don't, or just something along those lines. I think it can almost sometimes come across as a little bit naive in a weird way, even though I wouldn't think of Lilith in the 8th house as naive. I think they just want to skip that 5th house, 7th house relationship thing and go right into the 8th house. And with that, they lose a lot of the time that you have to put into to get to that 8th house relationship, if that makes sense.
Right. Typically, the way that things go with normal Scorpio energy, if you will, classic Scorpio energy, is that there is this propensity to dive into the deep end immediately, to get deep and attached. And then there's that sensation of suddenly the rug getting pulled out from under them, of them losing whatever it is that they are attached to. And then after having that rug pulled out from under them, they understand that they have these deep feelings that sometimes lead them to heartbreak, and then they create a reserved sort of character where it's mysterious and magnetic and all of those things that we see about Scorpio, where it's at the same time reserved and also deep and willing to go to the depths of places with people very intimately. Now, that's not exactly the same experience with Lilith in the 8th house, because Lilith doesn't have the immediate go in head first. Lilith has the exile experience. And especially with Lilith being an energy that wants to take over, envelop, Scorpio in its more unhealthy sort of manifestation can want to take in and envelop and own, but the 8th house is all about shared ownership. So the thing with Lilith in the 8th house is that she doesn't think what's yours is ours and what's mine is ours. She thinks what's yours is mine, right? And so the exile experience with Lilith in the 8th house is whether it relates to literal possessions, whether it relates to people's bodies, people's desire to be in any kind of relationship with you, whatever, there's this sense of what's mine is mine and it can't be yours. And so then Lilith becomes obsessed with taking over other people in some sort of way, making them hers, giving herself control over something or someone. And in that, there is that immediacy of like, you give me an inch, I'll take a mile. You say that you'll share your smoothie with me, I'm gonna take your house. I don't know. Like,
just big jumps, yeah.
Yeah, maybe not your house, but like now we're getting married or whatever. And now I own you in this very practical sense or whatever. And that's where you wouldn't think like Lilith or 8th house energy in general is naive. But because the Lilith in the 8th house doesn't get the rug pulled out from under them feeling that Scorpio usually gets, or that anything in the 8th house usually gets, there's the feeling of like, I wasn't allowed this, so I'm gonna go after it. And I don't have the reservation because I was also exiled from the rug pulled out from under me feeling. I was exiled from the loss of everything feeling. Another thing is that when you're exiled from that kind of feeling, and you also have this inherent darkness, moodiness, melancholia, desire for power that Lilith in the 8th house can have, they might put themselves in dangerous, toxic, inappropriate situations to justify why they feel that inner darkness inside of themselves. So that itch that Lilith needs to scratch in the 8th house could very well be really dangerous. Putting yourself in dangerous situations, but also having the propensity to victimize yourself in general, instead of regenerating and becoming more powerful at the hands of something else, letting yourself be at the effect of that negative energy, of that draining energy, because it sort of validates your feelings of, oh, I have this darkness inside of me and now there's a reason that I feel that. Because in the exile experience, you might not have a practical instance of like, yes, I feel this way because X, Y, and Z happened in my life. it can be like, I crave that feeling, even though X, Y, and Z didn't happen to me in my life.
Yes, I want to go back to that thing that Nina was talking about of shared resources, but more specifically, like she was saying, of I'm entitled to your resources, but you aren't entitled to mine, because I think that's a big theme, a real lust for other people's things, and even an entitlement to it as well. And kind of speaking into that, Nina brought up that rug pulled out from under you feeling, and I kind of think with Lilith in the 8th house, you don't have that feeling because there was never a rug, a soft little comfy rug for you to like lay on in the first place. I feel like you never had that feeling of comfort, of safety. There's always been this feeling like something's wrong. I need to always be hyper aware, like something's brewing under the surface, or even just like you're too young to understand the concept of what has happened to you, that you couldn't even establish that that rug was there, if that makes sense. Like if something sexual happened to you at a young age, that might be something that you don't understand fully until you're so much older, and that rug, that comfy rug wasn't even there for it to be taken away, you know? And speaking of that obsession with shared resources, I try to dress a little bit like the Lilith energy of the video that we're doing, and Lilith in the 8th house kind of gets the rap for this, and I have to say I really agree, of being a gold digger placement. And so I kind of tried to dress up in my like milfy gold digger, like almost like, I know I'm just putting this and I wish that I looked like this, but you know, Sopranos mob wife kind of vibe. I don't know.
Have you ever seen Carmela? Have you ever seen Carmela, the Sopranos mob wife?
I am obsessed with her. I know this is not her vibe, like she's way gothier, way gothier. But like this top, I have had sitting in my closet, and I always think about getting rid of it because I'm like, it's too older for me. Like I can't wear this until I'm older. Like I have to grow into it. And so that's why I was like, okay, I think this is the, the video for it. A perfect example, and I'm not going into celebrities now, I just have to mention these two people. Anna Nicole Smith, hers is in Taurus. You know, she married older because, you know, she's just waiting for him to die so she can get his money. The perfect example of lust for other people's assets, and that's very literal. That's kind of through one person. But another side of that, I think, is Jeff Bezos, because he has it in Scorpio in the 8th house. And who hoards other people's assets more than Jeff Bezos? He is one of the richest people, and basically he feels entitled to everyone's money. He feels entitled to not pay his workers a good amount. He feels entitled to not solve world hunger, which he can do. You know, he feels so entitled to keeping this money. I think that that's another way that the Lilith in the 8th house can go, is it might not just be one person, it might just be like this overarching, like, yeah, I deserve to be the wealthiest person in the world and hoard all this stuff, like duh.
Yeah, and hoarding is a big thing as well. Again, it's this attachment, this desperation, because one thing is that what is the goal in getting those shared resources with Lilith in the 8th house? Lilith, you know, obviously wants to scratch that itch. She didn't get what she wanted inherently, and so when she gets it, she doesn't want to let it go. Even if the thing that she acquires is extremely practical to use and have as a resource or share. Once Lilith gets her hands on what she wants and didn't have before, it's very hard to grapple with the idea that she could go back to that place of being without. And again, I feel like we haven't said this in a while in this series. Lilith is very nonsensical. So Jeff Bezos, I'm sure he spends his money on like crazy things, but I think that he also just hoards a lot, because honestly, what do you do?
Well, what could you buy after a certain point? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so at that point, it becomes a hoarding thing. Whereas you think of like J.K. Rowling, I think, was the first person to get off of the Forbes list of billionaires or millionaires from all of the philanthropy that she was doing. And so that's something that, you know, Jeff Bezos could do, but the hoarding and the desire to hold on to that is too strong.
To kind of go more into what Nina was talking about earlier, I feel like with Lilith in the 8th house, they will almost rebel against not being allowed to show that 8th house part of them. They will rebel, and they can sometimes put that stuff, air that stuff out there more than a lot of people. On one end of the spectrum, they have this real, like, almost fetish for privacy and their privacy, but then on the other end of the spectrum, they're constantly airing all their shit out. Like, if you've ever talked to a Lilith in the 8th house person, if they feel comfortable with you or whatever it may be, or maybe, I don't even know, maybe they don't, they will just kind of like lay their shit out on the table and just kind of throw it all onto you, because maybe they've been told to keep that stuff quiet for so long, and so now they're like, fuck that, I'm gonna air all this stuff out under my terms. But sometimes it can almost go a little bit too far, and it can feel as though it's like their crowning accomplishment. I know 2 people with this placement, and they both have very personal finstas that they, you know, they just air it all out as well. So it can just be something along those lines.
The 8th house and Scorpio energy in general is sort of dubbed the psychologist house. Scorpio is the natural psychologist. And I feel like with Lilith in the 8th house, there can definitely be that aspect of the natural psychologist, but in that twisted, unhealthy way where you're wanting to get other people's information. Again, like, what's yours is mine, and that means your deepest, darkest secrets, everything that is most intimate about you, I want it to be mine. And then there's also that sense of that power in which, in the psychologist position, you don't have to share your stuff. You can get all of that person's information and not have to air out your dirty laundry, especially if you feel like that person isn't deserving or you can't trust that person. Now, the reason why a Lilith in the 8th house might want to share their dirty laundry, air that stuff out, is again that sense of like proving their 8th house nature. The motivation behind why a Lilith in the 8th house might want to air out their dirty laundry is sometimes for the sake of manipulating the person that they are trying to win over, trying to seduce. Maybe they're thinking, if I make them comfortable, the more that they'll give to me and the more I'll be able to take from them.
Lilith in the 8th house is common for you to grow up around people with psychological issues where they might pick at you in ways that aren't true or inappropriate. But whatever it is, I just see a lot of people with Lilith in the 8th house having this hyper defensiveness. Like, you come at me, I'll come at you times 1,000, and I'll attack all the things that are that Chiron parts that, you know, you shouldn't hit. You know, I'll hit those even harder. You know, it's kind of like no holds barred with that kind of stuff can sometimes be how this manifests. The feeling of revenge is very common with the 8th house. But with Lilith adding in there, it's going to be even more extreme, I think, because Lilith is going to rebel. And so if somebody's trying to kind of make you feel betrayed or make you feel like you've been sucked dry by somebody, some energies in the 8th house might almost kind of succumb to that, or even, you know, gain life force from that feeling. But Lilith, I feel like, is going to rebel against that and is going to seek the revenge. They can go really, really far with this and really, really feel like they're not finished until they get their final revenge. And they can have a lot of trouble letting go of this stuff. This also might have something to do with the fact as to why they sometimes air out their stuff a little bit more, because they want that revenge. Like Nina kind of said, it is kind of for manipulation, like, feel bad for me, hate this person, you know, they want people to know. But I mean, also sometimes it can just come from, I've been smacked down so many times, like, I'm not just being quiet about this, I'm going to say something. It could also be a little bit of both, you know?
There's always that element, you know, take whatever resonates with you. It can manifest in a billion different ways. I think it's interesting that Shaina brought up that as someone with Lilith in the 8th house, you might be surrounded by people with mental illness, and that can be a theme in your early formative experiences. And I think that's interesting because in that case, when you're a child interacting with people who have been through a lot of deep shit that has manifested as mental illness, you can have that feeling of exile, like, I haven't experienced that, I haven't gotten to go through that. And that's very Lilith in the 8th house. And then again, trying to chase that feeling, trying to relate to that feeling because of that exile experience. But also, it plants the seed for your entitlement to other people's deepest, darkest secrets and deepest emotions and intimacy with other people. And it sets up that power dynamic that is very Lilith in the 8th house, wherein you're the one who holds the power and doesn't need to share their deepest, darkest secrets because, you know, in your formative years you might not have any yet, and they're the ones who dump out all of their guts towards you and you soak it up and you use it. How do you use someone being intimate with you emotionally, mentally, physically? What does Lilith like about that? Basically, it gives Lilith her sense of power, her sense of dominance, and her sense of like, I am magnetic enough to have someone confide in me in that way. I am powerful enough and worthy enough to have someone confide in me in that way, and those resources are then my resources. Lilith in the 8th house wants to step into that role of being magnetic, sexy, powerful, attractive in all of those ways. And sometimes that means attracting sort of easy targets. I sort of think of sometimes really unhealthy Scorpio energy as Hades and Persephone, where it's easy to sort of absorb that young, innocent, or otherwise vulnerable character, and then it does give you this sense of power, even though if you think it through, it's like, could you think of any more easy of a target than Persephone? Like, you think of Anna Nicole Smith, even the old guy that she dated, it's like, wow, look at that, he got her, he is powerful enough to get the hottest chick on the block or whatever. But in reality, it's like, could you think of anyone more easy?
Yeah, more vulnerable and susceptible to that. Like, yeah, I totally see what you're saying. I kind of want to touch a little bit more on trust issues. These people can go through these things of where they're constantly testing everyone around them, where they're almost like putting them in situations to test them. I think that Lilith in the 8th house also has ancestral Lilith-like problems, because anything in the 8th house is like passed down, you know, and it has to do more with like your secret family stuff. So there could be some Lilith stuff going on, and you might feel a lot of the brunt of that, or some kind of Lilith-y kind of karma or something along those lines. Or I was kind of also thinking like maybe this is something where I saw this kind of as a theme a little bit with Lilith in the 8th house celebrities, of like them only knowing one side of their family. Like even Jeff Bezos, like he only really, I think, knew one side of his family, and so like the other side is a secret to you. So like that can add that air of like Lilith in the 8th house kind of like mystery.
Yeah, the 8th house and family isn't a very obvious connection, but the 8th house is inheritances. So that's where that connection comes from. And it's interesting if Lilith in the 8th house has this pattern of not knowing one side of your family, because it's literally being exiled from an inheritance. Even if that is like not a literal inheritance, but if it's like just inheriting their traits, their attributes from being nurtured by that side of the family.
So the first person that I want to talk about, which I was like, oof, connections, because if you watch the Lilith and Scorpio video, I talked about Oliver Stone and how he did the Snowden movie, and you know who has Lilith in the 8th house? Edward Snowden himself has it in Capricorn. So it makes sense that they teamed up to make this Scorpio 8th house Lilith movie.
Starring Shailene Woodley, a Scorpio.
Oh, is she? Oh, that's so funny. They would.
I think she is. Because I remember we watched that movie together and we were like, why? Why her?
Yeah. You know what's funny? I forgot that we watched that movie together, and when you said Shailene Woodley, I was instantly like, why? Like, I had the same response. And I'm like, glad I haven't changed. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is a movie about leaking highly classified information that has to do with secrets, that has to do, you know, with feeling like your privacy is being exposed. And now he's had to go into hiding. He's had to go into extreme privacy.
Yeah, it's so interesting because everything that he's leaking, it's like, it shouldn't be classified information. It's like that weird thing of like, we should make this public, but I'm also at the same time like taking stuff that is private to you and I'm making it public, and so it's like, it's mine, I'm making it mine, I'm making it ours, I'm making it a shared resource. It's that really weird line of like 8th house secret but also shared.
It's in Capricorn, which I feel like it's my duty to expose this. Like I feel like it's like I have to, you know, that Capricorn. Somebody else who has this is I think I'm gonna butcher her last name, Danielle Bregoli, the Catch Me Outside girl. She has this in Aries, and she was really exploited for fame. After she had that interview, her mom sent her, who she had an abusive mother, I'm pretty sure, sent her to this camp for like troubled teens. There was a lot of abuse going on, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, just kind of all sorts there, and it was a really, really hard, dark time after that, which I think has a lot to do with Aries Lilith being in the 8th house. And also she was obviously heavily sexualized from a young age as well. And I'm pretty sure like the second she turned 18, she got an OnlyFans.
Yeah, definitely. It's really sad. I remember when she made her OnlyFans, it was like, you guys have been asking for it.
Exactly, yeah. Like it's been heavily anticipated, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel bad laughing now. But when I was looking up celebrities, I saw Machine Gun Kelly and I was like, oh my god, did I fuck this up? Like, I thought he had a Lilith in Scorpio. There's actually another Machine Gun Kelly who was before the rapper, who's like an American gangster from Tennessee, who has it in the 8th house. So I thought it was so interesting, again, that connection of like Lilith and Scorpio, Lilith in the 8th house, and also just the fact that he's like an American mobster and gangster, and he has Lilith in the 8th house, like, oh, you do shit to me, I will go to the deepest depths of revenge and take you out, you know?
There's really nothing more scorpionic than mob activity, because it's literally like, I deserve your wealth. I deserve my revenge on you. It's also just like the epitome of making money in sneaky ways.
Exactly. And also I feel like the fact that it's like we handle stuff within us, like it's that privacy. Like you don't go and expose the mob, like you handle it within the mob, you know? Dave Navarro is somebody who also has this in Aries, and one of his first formative experiences, if you know anything about him, was incredibly tragic. His mother and his aunt were murdered by an ex-boyfriend, and he said that the trial was also something that was super traumatic, like having to testify, seeing like the crime scene photos next to him, and I was like, that's another interesting connection. The 8th house rules like court, and like Dave Navarro said, he has one of these formative experiences in court being a very traumatic experience.
And also when Aries is in the 8th house, like those are formative experiences for your individuality.
Exactly. And see, that's a very important thing, is like the sign really does have a lot to do with like how it's going to play out. Like I feel like Danielle Bregoli and Dave Navarro both had very like violent like being thrust into things at a young age kind of experiences, which does go have a lot to do with Aries. Edward Snowden didn't experience his until much later in life because it's in Capricorn, you know?
And it's more about the public perception of all of that information leaked. I feel like you hear something like Bad Baby, Danielle Bregoli, and you're like, that is so Lilith in the 8th house. Like that's a great example of Lilith in the 8th house, but just because it's a really Martian Lilith in the 8th house, it's very Mars, it's very sexual.
It's Mars and Mars, yeah, it's more intuitive almost, yeah. Somebody else who has Lilith in the 8th house, and I think her whole life personifies this so well because it is conjunct her moon. These are major themes in her life, you know, and this is going to show up more than just somebody with just Lilith in the 8th house. But Azalea Banks has this in Capricorn, conjunct her moon in the 8th house. If you did not know, her father died when she was 2 years old, and then she grew up with a single mother. She even mentioned that when her father died, she kind of like didn't fully understand it because she was too young. So like the last thing she said to her like dead corpse father was like, he's got a booger in his nose, ew, because you're so young, like you're at this place that you can't even comprehend. There might be some feelings of like regret and guilt with how you dealt with that first experience, that like now later in life when anything happens, you're like, I need to give this more weight because I didn't when I was, you know, that first time, and I'm not going to let myself do that again and live with that, you know, maybe.
Yeah, another reason why Lilith in the 8th house might have that exile experience is not that they didn't experience like a rug being pulled out from under them feeling, but rather because they did, but again, they couldn't process it, they couldn't comprehend it. And so there's that feeling of like, I have this darkness within me, but I can't consciously put a label on it. You can't process it to really understand it and own it.
Something a little bit more known about Azalea Banks is that if you know her, you probably know that she's been canceled 1,000 times for all the shit that she has said to almost every goddamn celebrity out there. She's also a Gemini, so that's gonna add to it, but I just feel like it comes from that Lilith in the 8th house place of this hyper defensiveness. The second somebody says just one little thing to her, she's like, time to go off on a 10-minute Instagram story where I attack every little piece of them and no holds barred. You know, I feel like she's just the perfect example of that kind of energy.
That sort of behavior in Lilith in the 8th house comes again from what's yours is mine. I can take that information, I can use it to whatever selfish wants that I have. Like, that's where the no holds bar comes from. There's no sense of like, okay, I'm gonna respect your privacy, or okay, I'm gonna respect your boundaries. Like,
it's like, oh,
anything goes.
You hurt me, I can hurt you as much as I want.
Yeah, there's that revenge aspect, but there's also with someone who maybe has lived in the 8th house and hasn't gone through that sort of like fame trauma of having their names in people's mouths, they can also just, again, ignorantly and naively be like, oh yeah, this is this person's deepest, darkest secret. Just because there's no idea of like, oh, boundaries? Oh, what's yours isn't mine? It's just like no holds bar, even in the most innocent way.
Another example, Johnny Knoxville has this in Virgo, and he's also got a lot of other stuff in the 8th house that contributes to this as well. But, I mean, he has a literal obsession with pain and humiliation. 8th house things. He like broke his urethra and it's in Virgo, so we had to like insert a catheter 2 times a day, which is the most like Virgo Lilith in the 8th house experience in like such an extreme way.
Yeah,
but
like it fucks with your health. Like, your obsession literally fucks with your health, and it's a sexual obsession. It's, God, astrology is real.
Yeah, I know. Madeline McCann, she's the child that went missing in her crib because her parents were off having a dinner or something and she got taken in from her crib. So I thought that was really interesting and very Taurus Lilith in the 8th house, because that Taurus, Lilith in Taurus, of that comfort, she was taken from her crib, the ultimate place of comfort, of security, of like, it's like your little rug. You know, when you were too young to even realize that you were being taken away from this place that you should feel the safest in. You know what I mean? I feel like that's a very extreme Lilith in the 8th house and Taurus kind of example.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, the consensus is that she's gone into sex trafficking sense.
Yeah.
And that is also, you know, unfortunately a very real example of the worst end in which Lilith in the 8th house can go into, where it becomes this experience of becoming a shared resource for others without having your say in it. And just the fact that it's in Taurus as well, there's no definition or lines around what's mine, what's yours, what I'm entitled to, what you're entitled to when it comes to me, my body, and that stuff.
Kesha has this in Cancer, and she recently sued her producer for being verbally, emotionally, sexually, physically, just like all kinds of abusive. I'm pretty sure that she unfortunately did not win her case, and she was just trying to get her rights to her music.
Yeah, and it's another thing that has to do with shared resources. On one level, yes, it's something that he produced, she worked on, it is their joint thing, but there sometimes can be a more negative connotation of like, you want everything to be yours, what's ours is mine, what's yours is mine, and it can sound like we're painting it in this light of like, you're so selfish for wanting things to be yours. But it can also come from a deep place of hurt. I'm never gonna say like, Kesha, come on, he produced it, you guys worked on it together. Like, no, I feel for her, my heart goes out to her, and it's absolutely a natural experience to want to have that be yours, have that joint stuff be yours, because your power was taken away in one instance, so you want to gain your power back in that way. And that's also just like the premise of court in general. Like, your power was taken away, you were hurt unjustly, and now you want to gain some power in some sort of way, usually monetarily, shared resource. So many tax dollars go into court and all of that stuff. But also, Kesha is quite spiritual, and I know that the song that is associated with this sort of legal traumatic battle that she's been having with her producer is the song Pray. It's actually quite a healthy, high vibrational energy of this Lilith in the 8th house, where the revenge isn't like she has to feel the need to enact this revenge on him, but just thinking like, I hope you're praying, like I hope that you are going through it. I hope that like justice is being served in the most spiritual, non-practical way.
Right.
And in the same vein, she says, I hope that you can find your peace, because it's also wanting to share all of it. And like, it seems that through this journey, she's been through this trial of fire, but she's also found this sort of spiritual peace. And she's hoping that he goes through the exact same trial of fire, and in that way shares that experience that she's gone through because of him, and just like wanting that experience to be shared on both sides, which is a very 8th house thing.
Yeah, also, I'm pretty sure she's a double Pisces, right? So that also influences maybe some of that maturity of dealing with that placement.
It goes from wake up in the morning, brush my teeth with a bottle of Jack, to I hope your soul is changing and you find your peace.
Also, I feel like she felt like a shared resource. Like, I'm not a shared resource. I'm my own person, but I'm being treated as though I am an object and as though I am a shared resource to make money off of, and my music is a shared resource. Like, no, this is my personal thing. This is my heart and soul, and this is my personal project, and it's being treated as though it's his.
Yes, and I think that another thing to clarify with this exile experience with Lilith in the 8th house of not getting to share, it's also not getting to share equally. The 8th house is ultimately about when two become one, not when one becomes under attached to and dependent on another, you know? So that can also be an example of a Lilith in the 8th house exile experience.
Yes, so that is our full Lilith in the 8th house video. As we mentioned, we've got lots of links down below. If you'd like, you can get a reading from either of us. Those links will be down below. We also have different YouTube pages and Instagrams, and I have a TikTok, and Nina has merch and all that kind of stuff. Next up for everybody asking is Lilith in Sagittarius, because we are going in order and we are not going to stray from that because we have 6th house planets, and so we are sticking with it.
We also have Saturn in the 10th house. So why would we abandon our plan?
Exactly. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Talk to you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.